Alright, so this is the recap video for week 5, so I'll be looking at the week 4 material. Week 4 material was as part of the egotism section, so we're continuing to look at this idea of self-absorption and those people that spent time on themselves. In week 3, it was about radical egotism. It was about people that were completely devoted to themselves. So we looked at Sandy Hook, and we looked at the Westboro Baptist Church. The week 3 case studies were a bit more ambiguous. It wasn't as clear, number one, that the people were spending too much time on themselves, even if you think they might be egotistic, and two, whether they were egotistic at all. There's certainly cases to be made that they weren't being egotistic. And so those case studies were the Razor Ramon video, the Rock of Ages going to see the show, and the Newman Shuttle service. So with regard to the Razor Ramon video, for those that would say he's too egotistic, and many of you made this point, you said, look, he abandoned his family. He pursued fame, he pursued money, he pursued drugs, and he did that at the expense of his family. That he had a wife, he had 2 young kids, and then instead of being there for those kids, he chose his own personal glorification. He chose to want to be the center of attention. He wanted people to chant his name more than he wanted to be a father. That is the position of those that viewed him as an egotist and mostly viewed him as immoral. In other words, that this glorification, this fame, wasn't worth giving up his family, that he ought not to have done that. When we look into it more, certainly he became a drug addict, certainly became addicted to his alter ego, this Razor Ramon character. One of the big questions becomes, was he at fault for his drug addiction? Was he morally responsible for that? For those that would say he is, certainly you could say, look, he chose to do drugs. He chose to drink alcohol continuously. That was his decision, and that was egotistic because going down that path led him to become more and more incapable of being there for his family. For those that would say, no, this isn't a product of egotism, you could argue that he was born into an alcoholic family. He had these dispositions and these tendencies already within him. And you could also say, look, he was in a career that you could not get away from drugs and sex and alcohol and all that kind of stuff. It was simply part of the industry in terms of what the employees would do, what the wrestlers would do. It is an intense party, continuously traveling type of atmosphere. So you might look at that and you might say, look, he wasn't responsible, he couldn't help himself, he was subject to forces and desires and inclinations beyond his ability to control. On the other hand, if you want to come back with a rebuttal, some have said that his problem and that his moral responsibility lay in the fact, precisely because he came from an alcoholic family, he should have known even more that he should not have started that path of alcoholism, that he shouldn't have taken the first drink, that he shouldn't have taken the first hit, precisely because he knew where this would lead, and precisely because he knew he had this predisposition. Some people said that is why, he became an addict, and at a certain point it was beyond his control, but he did have the power and the responsibility to not take the drugs in the first place. Others in the same vein argued, look, he went to rehab many, many times, went to rehab at least 10 times, and some have argued that if he really wanted to get better, if he really wanted to be a father, he would have taken that rehab more seriously, and that was his egotism. The final thing I want to talk about with Razor Ramon, and a number of you talked about in your posts, is the idea of, would he be immoral if it was just him? If he wasn't letting down his family, if he didn't have 2 young kids, if he didn't have a wife? And many of you said, no, he wouldn't be immoral because essentially he wouldn't be hurting anybody. If you want to go screw up your own life, if you want to trash your abilities and your skills, that's on you. But others argued that, look, each human life has a purpose, each human life has dignity, each human life has a worth, and that when he did this, when he destroyed himself, that essentially there's something immoral about that. So it's not only harming the others, It can also be harming yourself. Could be considered an immoral position. It could also be viewed as egotistic, as a kind of a waste of one's talents. Because you could also look and say, look, he was entertaining millions of fans. And because of his drug addiction, because of his alcoholism, he deteriorated physically rapidly, and you saw this on the video. He was a shell of his former self. And because of that, he couldn't continue to entertain. And one could argue he let down his fans as well. All right, so that's the back and forth with regard to Razor Ramon and whether or not he was egotistic and whether or not he was too egotistic. My personal position would be that he was ultimately too egotistic. Even though I don't think he was certainly not a radical egotist. And I say he wasn't a radical egotist because he did seem to have remorse. He did seem to have this regrets. And if you only cared about yourself, you wouldn't be having that regret. You wouldn't feel sorry for what you've done to your family. All right, the second video, and this is a very, very short video, a promo video for Rock of Ages, a Broadway show. It's also become a movie. And essentially, these people came out of the theater and they said, I saw it 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, 100 times, 180 times. Now, I think, part of this was just for the commercial. I'm sure they told them to say, you've gone to see the show, 80 times or 100 times. But even if it was fake, even if it was just words and put in their mouths, the principle and the idea is still interesting. Is it immoral to go see a show like this that many times? And certainly many of you, I think probably most of the posts, said no, it's not immoral. It's their money. It makes them happy. They can be entertained. They can do what they want. It's on them. And I think that's the reaction that many of us would have, and especially in this day and age. But if you wanted to kind of go the egotistic route, I think there's certainly ways that you can make that argument. Essentially saying, look, if you're going to that show, let's say 50 times, and the tickets are probably $100 a ticket, so then you're talking about $5,000 at the very least. The amount of time that it takes to go to that show certainly means that you're spending an awful lot of money and an awful lot of time on something that would seem to be purely just for pleasure, purely just because you kind of enjoy it. Now, I think many of you rightly noted that, look, spending time on things that you enjoy and doing things that you enjoy is not a bad thing. In fact, one could argue that it's a principle of self-respect, that everybody needs some R&R, everybody needs some pleasure, everybody needs to do things that they enjoy to make their lives full, to make their lives complete, and to live a healthy life, both physically and mentally. So you can certainly argue that there's nothing wrong with R&R, there's nothing wrong with doing things that give you pleasure. But up to a certain point, and this is a matter of degree. Perhaps there's a degree past which that kind of these kind of decisions create this kind of indulgence, this self-absorption, this sense of spending too much time on luxury, too much time on just your pleasures. Because certainly a life just devoted to your pleasures, just devoted to what makes you happy, many would argue is immoral. You're failing to fulfill your duty to others, and you're failing to really get the most out of yourself by pushing yourself. Instead of these pleasures being a kind of a break and a reward, they become the whole. And so, what were these people at the point where they're becoming too luxurious, too, into their own kind of pleasures? I would argue that yes, they were. I would argue that the time and the money that they spent on seeing the show, a show that simply repeated itself, was taking away resources that could have been better used. Again, you can accept that it's okay to do things that give you pleasure. But if that pleasure requires a tremendous amount of financial or just time resources, then you have to ask, what else could I have been doing with those resources? And if the answer is I could have been helping people, and I could have been contributing to society more often, then you have to seriously consider whether that was the moral decision, and your inability to do so being a selfish decision based on just pursuing pleasure. And these people going to that show that many times, it's not even just the money, it's on the tickets, it's the money, parking, it's the money spending time going to restaurants. Now, some have argued that, look, it's precisely the fact that they spent money on restaurants, that they spent money on the theater, that they're doing a good thing. They're contributing to the livelihoods of the ticket takers, the parking attendants, the concession stand sellers, the actors and actresses, and everything that goes along with the theater, the director, the crew, the technical people. You could argue, look, they're really doing it for them. These people benefit. But I would say, I would wonder, and I question whether they're really doing it for those people, and maybe you could help more people that are more in need by spending your money elsewhere, or at least not spending all of it on that show. And ultimately, you've got to ask yourself, well, how far do you take that principle of pleasure, doing whatever gives me pleasure? Because a lot of you use that. A lot of you said, look, if it makes them happy, if it gives them pleasure, what's the problem? And that goes back to some of the earlier stuff we talked about in the early part of the course, in the sense, well, what if what gives me pleasure is doing heroin? Is that okay? What if what gives me pleasure is, as I'm a businessman and I like to kind of screw over people in the third world? Get them to make stuff for my company and give them dirt wages. What if that power, gives me a rush? Is that okay? What if what gives me pleasure is, having sex with young kids? Certainly those kind of pleasures, most people would say are immoral. And so the idea that just because it gives you pleasure, it's okay, not necessarily. That's not sufficient. All right, the last category, the last case study, something very close to home, the idea of the Newman RAB shuttle service. And I think most of the posts tended to be for the shuttle service, essentially saying, look, a couple main arguments. Probably the most prominent argument was this idea that some people really need it. Some people are handicapped, some people are injured, some people are old, and so you need it for those people. Two, many people argued that you need it, and it's a really good thing for when the weather's not great, whether it's because it's too cold or because it's raining. That the shuttle really is a good thing there. The third reason that people tended to give in defense of the shuttle was the idea of time, and it's quicker. You can't get to classes from the RAB to Bachman and from Bachman to the RAB in enough time without the shuttle. A couple people said, related back to that second point in the weather, some people said when it's really hot, if you walk it, you're going to get sweaty and you're not going to feel comfortable and you're not going to get the most out of your class. And so, okay, all those were reasonable answers, and all those answers had some legitimacy and were expanded upon in the discussion posts. But here's my question to you. Let's think about what that shuttle might cost per year. The cost of the shuttle in terms of maintenance, the cost of the shuttle in terms of having bought it in the first place, the cost of the shuttle in terms of gas, the cost of the shuttle in terms of the person to drive it. I would guess between $100,000 and $150,000. Again, just a complete and utter guess on my part. But if you're spending $100,000 and $150,000 on that van, which I think ultimately is a matter of convenience for most Newman students, then is it worth it? Because that $100,000 or $150,000, that comes from somewhere. It ultimately comes from you, as the students, as the people that pay for the course. And is it right to raise the tuition of the student body in order that those that use the shuttle are convenienced? Is convenience enough of a reason, a sufficient justification to raise the tuition level at Newman University, again, at whatever amount that is? Some people are paying, or let me put it like this, everyone is paying in order that some may have greater convenience. And if you look at it like that, it's not as clear that it is a moral thing to do. And it's not as clear that it's not selfish by those who simply want to be convenienced to make others pay for that convenience. The idea of those that really need it. There certainly are some that really could need it, but I imagine that percentage is rather small. And so what do you do in that situation? Well, perhaps you just have the individual campus safety member drive the person up, and so they can call in. In terms of this idea of, look, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's raining, it's snowing, it is really kind of interesting that in human history, the idea of walking up and down a hill would be considered a very mild hardship physically. If you went back 25, 50, 100 years, people would deal with a heck of a lot more in terms of physical discomfort. And so that raises the question, are you, as the Newman student body, becoming entitled and becoming lazy? And if the shuttle service produces and promotes laziness and entitlement, then it is, again, a moral question as to whether the shuttle should continue. The other argument that some people gave was the idea of time. But I wonder, how often that shuttle is faster. People on the discussion boards, and certainly those that I've talked to, often say, look, if you really think about it, the shuttle is not as fast. By the time people load up, by the time they get going down the hill, by the time you offload, you could very easily make it down the hill right in the same time or quicker. And especially if the shuttle's kind of in between. And so, if it's not really a time issue, then again it goes back to this idea of convenience and perhaps laziness. I once was on the shuttle and I heard this young 20-year-old kid, Newman student, say, I will never walk up that hill. And it really kind of shocked me in the sense that, look, you're young, you're 20 years old, you should be walking up that hill. It shouldn't be a major issue for you. And you might also say, look, if we did that, if we deceased, if we discontinued the shuttle service, you'd have people that are living a healthier and happier life. And if that's the case, maybe Newman has a moral duty to actually ban the shuttle, discontinue it for the sake of the health and well-being of the Newman student body. Perhaps when it's really raining, or perhaps when it's frigid, or when it's snowing, yeah, then you use the shuttle, but at other times, not so much. And again, it goes back to the egotism of, for the convenience, do you raise the tuition dollars? All right, so that is the recap of the Week 4 discussion boards, and I look forward to Week 5, where you're going to be talking about transitioning from a morality that begins in self-interest, but ultimately leads away from it.